Hello, Dr. Grande here. Today I'll be analyzing the case of Roberta Samard. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Roberta Samard was born in May 1953 and lived in Albany, Oregon. This is an hour and 15 minutes south of Portland. She worked as a secretary at a paper mill. Roberta married, but that marriage ended in divorce. In 1996, Roberta met a man named Kenneth Arlen Samard, who went by the name Ken. He had been born in January 1958 and lived in Albany, Oregon. In 1976, he graduated from high school and in the next year enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Ken married a woman named Vicky, but they divorced. He married for a second time to a woman named Cindy. That marriage ended in divorce as well. Ken worked at the same paper mill where Roberta worked. He was a mechanic there. After becoming romantically involved, Roberta and Ken married in Las Vegas on September 2, 2000. In 2009, the paper mill where Roberta and Ken worked closed. Ken started his own roofing company. In 2012, the couple purchased a 5-bedroom house in Millersburg, Oregon, just 6 miles north of Albany. People who knew the couple viewed them as successful and well-adjusted. Roofing can be a dangerous business, which Ken found out the hard way when he fell off a roof. Both his heels were shattered upon slamming into the ground, and he was out of work for a while. After he recovered, he went to school to become an HVAC technician and found a job. Ken was rebuilding his career and appeared to be doing well. Unfortunately, his newfound enjoyment would not last long. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On November 16, 2015, at 6:10 a.m., Roberta called 911 and said she shot her husband. The only explanation she offered was that Ken was not supposed to be there. When the police arrived, they discovered Ken dead on the back porch of his house. Here is what they found during the course of their investigation. Ken had been shot once in the neck with a .38 caliber revolver. The weapon was found near the back door, not far from his body. It looks like a Smith & Wesson 642. This revolver has an aluminum alloy frame and a stainless steel cylinder and barrel. The weapon can handle .38 special, including plus P rounds. It is designed for concealed carry, therefore has an internal hammer to avoid snagging on clothing. If somebody's trying to defend themselves, they don't want the trigger of their weapon to get caught, say, on a pants pocket. They want to be able to pull the weapon out cleanly and point it where it needs to be pointed. The revolver, which had pink custom grips equipped with a laser, belonged to Roberta. Ken was dressed in his work clothing. His lunchbox, mug, and car keys were found near his body. There was no sign of a struggle inside or outside the house. Roberta spoke to the police. She said that she was depressed because the house was in foreclosure. So Roberta and Ken were losing the house. They were no longer going to be able to live there. When Ken left for work that day at 6 a.m., Roberta retrieved her revolver. She walked around the house trying to work up the courage to do something terrible to herself with the weapon. Unexpectedly, Ken returned to the house, like maybe he needed to get something that he forgot, something that he needed for work. As he opened the back door, he saw Roberta standing just inside the house. He noticed her holding the revolver and took a step backward. This, of course, would be surprising. He probably wouldn't expect Roberta to be holding a firearm. Roberta lifted the revolver up in an effort to fire at herself quickly before Ken could intervene. She wanted to make an exit from this world, and she did not want Ken to stop her. As she was doing this, she ended up shooting Ken in the neck. So as she was moving her hand upward, she was pulling the trigger at the same time, and it discharged before it was pointed where she wanted it to be pointed. Roberta pulled the trigger deliberately, but didn't intend to kill Ken. Roberta was arrested and charged with first-degree manslaughter, but she soon received an upgrade to murder. The state thought that Roberta acted intentionally. In April 2017, Roberta was found guilty of murder. Her sentence was 25 years in prison. Roberta could be released as early as 2040 at the age of 87. Now moving to my analysis. Roberta Samard maintains her innocence. she claimed the shooting of her husband was accidental. She would never have harmed him deliberately. The state, of course, disagrees. Even though they have struggled to come up with a motive, they believe the evidence supports the idea that Roberta intentionally killed Ken. This brings me to the question, was Roberta guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that she was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Roberta appeared to have a problem with her spending. People who knew her said that she liked fancy things and would often purchase extravagant gifts for her friends. She wanted everyone to know that she had money. This spending habit caused a lot of tension between Roberta and Ken. The police found a notebook on Ken's desk where he wrote down his feelings about his wife. He accused Roberta of completely controlling their finances. For example, she was the only one who had the passwords for their bank accounts. Ken needed permission to spend money. If he did so without permission, it would always lead to an argument. Ken indicated that he let Roberta affect his self-esteem, and he wrote, "I give her power over me." As far as the future of the relationship, Ken wrote, "I'm just about fed up with it." Perhaps he was thinking about leaving Roberta. Roberta's out-of-control spending had consequences which extended beyond simply aggravating her husband, Ken. In the bottom of a clothes hamper in the Samard house, the police found a letter indicating that the Samard's house was in foreclosure. Ultimately, the house was sold to a man who flipped houses, so a man who bought the house with the intent of fixing it up and selling it for a profit. Roberta had negotiated with this investor to stay in the house a little longer. When it was time to leave, Roberta renegotiated and obtained another extension. The day of the killing, November 16, 2015, was the day that Roberta and Ken were supposed to vacate the residence. In the house, nothing was packed. It was like they had no intention of moving out that day. Ken found out about the foreclosure sometime earlier, but he thought that everything had worked out. He told a family member that it was just a mix-up, and Roberta had fixed everything. He was not going to lose his house. It seems like an incredible coincidence that the accidental shooting occurred on the last day the couple was allowed to be in the house. The circumstances surrounding the shooting itself were suspicious. Roberta admitted to shooting her husband in the neck and killing him. She is the one who pulled the trigger. Ken just happened to come back right at the moment when Roberta was getting ready to discharge the weapon. Out of all the places the bullet could have traveled, it just happened to fatally strike Ken. It didn't go through the glass of the back door. It didn't go into the floor. It didn't hit a wall. It hit one of the very few areas of all the areas it could have traveled that killed Ken. Roberta performed a reenactment of the shooting with the police. In her story, the gun discharged when Ken was standing about 18 inches away from the muzzle. This is difficult to believe considering how the autopsy revealed the revolver had been in contact with Ken's skin when it was fired. It was pressed up against his neck. Roberta said she could not remember if Ken had tried to grab the revolver, but there was no gunshot residue on his hands. This makes it seem like he did not grab the gun. The Smith & Wesson 642 is difficult to fire accidentally. About 12 pounds of force is required to pull the trigger. It is a double-action only revolver. It cannot be fired as single action because it has an internal hammer. The only way to fire the weapon is to apply 12 pounds of force to the trigger. In single-action variants of the J-frame revolver, which the Smith & Wesson 642 is, there is the option of firing single action, so a person can cock the hammer back and less force is required to pull the trigger. Roberta had taken this weapon to a shooting range before where she struggled to pull the trigger. Moving to the exculpatory factors, many people who knew Roberta and Ken described them as the perfect couple. Ken never said a bad word about Roberta to anyone. Technically speaking, Roberta could have accidentally shot and killed Ken. It is in the realm of possibility, albeit unlikely. If she was attempting to fire the weapon at herself, this explains why she pulled the trigger. So the force required to pull the trigger is not as relevant. That's pretty much it for exculpatory factors. Considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Roberta Samard was guilty of murder? Yes, she was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The timing of the shooting is difficult to overlook, even if one could look past all the other suspicious circumstances. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Roberta Samard was self-centered, shallow, distant, impulsive, ill-tempered, irresponsible, materialistic, dominant, controlling, manipulative, deceptive, cold, callous, and had a sense of entitlement. In her marriage to Ken, Roberta was in charge. She took Ken's money and did whatever she wanted with it. She had the mail sent to a P.O. box instead of to their house, controlled the passwords for the bank accounts, and gave her husband an allowance. He was largely in the dark about what was happening with their money. When Ken had ideas for starting a new business or anything like that, Roberta would shoot him down right away, suggesting he was bad with money. It was like she was trying to protect Ken from himself. She was the one who understood how to manage money, and he did not. Ken became increasingly frustrated with his wife. In his notebook, he indicated that she was always right, and she invalidated his feelings. Roberta represented herself as a superior money manager, but in reality, she overspent badly. In the months leading up to the murder, the house fell into foreclosure, and Roberta ran into some trouble with a credit card. Ken found out about the foreclosure, but Roberta convinced him it was just a mistake. He also found out about the credit card and wanted to discuss this matter with Roberta. It appears as though he was surprised to learn about the credit card. After losing the house, Roberta negotiated with the new owner to stay a little longer. Maybe she hoped the investor would forget that he bought the house, like he would just let her continue to live there forever. It was no big deal. Roberta was trying to figure out what to do, but there was no solution that she could tolerate. She did not want Ken to find out that she had destroyed their finances and lost their dream house. A sense of shame filled Roberta. From her perspective, it was better to murder Ken than to face that shame. Roberta had backed herself into a corner and waited to the last minute to act. She really didn't have a carefully constructed homicidal plan. As Ken walked out of the door to go to work that morning, Roberta produced the revolver and shot him once in the neck. She then pretended the shooting was accidental. It never occurred to Roberta that she would be held accountable for the murder. Her lack of empathy was so profound, she was unable to see herself as others viewed her. From her perspective, the circumstances were not suspicious at all. Among the many flaws in her hastily constructed plan was how Roberta failed to throw Ken's notebook away. He had recorded his feelings in the notebook, and they were not flattering toward Roberta. Ken was a thoughtful individual who was greatly affected by Roberta's selfish behavior. This was very frustrating for him. He was trying to work out his feelings and find some type of resolution. Roberta just assumed that Ken was shallow, like her, and he would never record his feelings. He was a simple man from her point of view. Now moving to my final thoughts. The major mystery in this case has always been the motive. Sure, Roberta had financial problems, but killing Ken did not solve those problems. Why would she do that? I think the motive possessed by Roberta was tied to pride and shame. She didn't want Ken to realize that she had failed, especially considering she had told him for many years that he was the problem as far as money. Like she could be trusted with money and he couldn't. It would have been pretty embarrassing to have that flipped around on her. Ken had family members who would have loaned him the money to pay for the mortgage. There was no need to lose the house. Ken rejected the offer by his family members because Roberta lied to him. He trusted that Roberta was not mismanaging money. In a sense, Ken believed his wife's assertion that she was protecting the money by keeping it away from him. He bought into her attempt to lower his self-esteem, but this was really nothing more than a distraction. Roberta was trying to keep her own shortcomings secret by attacking Ken. When the truth could no longer be concealed, she released the full fury of her shame. Her tight grip on the finances gave way to a tight grip on a revolver. Those are my thoughts on the case of Roberta Samard. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. I just want to add this reminder that I have a Patreon account that has several hundred pre-release videos. These pre-release videos are of the same quality as the videos I release to the public. Eventually they will be released, but I keep them in pre-release mode for a long time, sometimes for 6 months, a year, or more. So it's not like I produce these videos and I put them on Patreon for a couple days and then make them public. There's a real benefit to the Patreon, and the support really helps me. So if you could check it out, I would appreciate it. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video.